the blue wall of silence tumble in a courtroom in Minneapolis when policemen understand that they are committed to the oath rather than to their colleague. That's when we know a breakthrough is coming. That's when we know we can pass the George Floyd bill.
The Reverend Al Sharpton there making a push for police reform after former Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murdering George Floyd. On Capitol Hill, as we've reported yesterday, there's new momentum for action on police reform, with both Democrats and Republican Senator Tim Scott signaling that they can bring together a bill in the coming weeks. The Senate's lone black Republican member will also take center stage next week when he delivers the rebuttal to President Biden's address to Congress Wednesday. But this renewed push for reform by Democrats and at least one Republican, Tim Scott, already faces a wall of opposition from the right-wing media, which is doing its best to sabotage any chance of getting a lot of support and a head of steam behind reform with a steady stream of disinformation. Take a look at just some of what's airing on Fox News, all within hours of each other last night.
What's going to happen, everybody that is arrested, they're going to sue the officer every time. Then there will be nobody arrested. And, well, they'll succeed in defunding and dismantling the police.
These are policies that are killing people, and they're killing innocent people, and they're killing them by setting up situations where, frankly, the fewer police you have, the less well-trained they are, and the more they're intimidated by the media.
They're going to be afraid. Yeah, we got to go. But they're all going to be afraid to step in. They're going to be afraid to do the right thing.
Reverend Al Sharpton is here, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network. And Jason Johnson's here, politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University and a contributor to the GRIO as well as MSNBC. You know, Rev, I think we're all used to this stuff being on the air at that network. But what surprised me this week is two things. One, the attack against a jury verdict. And two, trying to tie and hobble Tim Scott, who they're going to elevate. It cheapens the gesture of elevating him next Wednesday night as the party's spokesperson for the rebuttal to President Biden.
It really undermines the credibility that Tim Scott could give a party that is in dire need of credibility, and to those that may be on the other side of the issues of criminal justice. They've just really cut his legs from under him with this rhetoric, and I would assume they're going to continue it. But I think what is really important here to look at is they are very blatantly saying that if police are held to accountability, they can't do their job, because in their view, their job is to do whatever they think is necessary and right. We are talking about a jury that found a police officer guilty of murder because he held his knee on a person's neck 9 minutes and 29 seconds. We're talking about a 26-year veteran police officer that claims she didn't know the difference between a gun and the instrument that she should or that she said she was intending on using. So the problem with that is they're saying that we should, in effect, live where police can do whatever they want, not be held accountable. Otherwise, we are dealing with some kind of recklessness. And I think that that really makes our point when people hear how they want no accountability, and you're doing it in a week where we're laying a 20-year-old young man to rest. I couldn't believe, while we were at the cemetery yesterday dealing with the last rites and committing the body of this young man, Don J. Wright, that they were doing this kind of rhetoric. It shows the American people the insensitivity they have and the misunderstanding they have that serve and protect does not mean don't question me, don't hold me accountable. There's no job in the country that people are given that kind of no boundaries, and policemen shouldn't either. Everybody's held accountable. Why aren't police held accountable for their actions?
You know, Jason, if you just look at the structural support, it's minority support for what we just played. It is starting to look like the gun debate, where 85% of Americans support background checks and closing the loopholes. I want to put some of the new approval ratings up. A new ABC Washington Post poll asked the question, should the country do more to hold police accountable for mistreatment of black people? 60% say U.S. should do more. Throughout the summer, all the protests, Black Lives Matter maintained public support in the high 60s, sometimes even into the 70s. This is the sort of radicalization that David Brooks writes about in the New York Times today of the Trump base.
Well, yeah, and here's the thing, Nicole, and I think this is important for people to understand. Just like the gun debate, as you said, this is a situation where the public wants one thing and a sort of ossified, crystallized group of opposition in Congress is refusing to follow what often their own constituents say is a better way to handle it. And this is why I've always sort of framed this debate about policing in terms of professionalism. And the Rev is exactly right. We wouldn't let other professions operate this way. Something that I've been paying attention to and researching, something I hope that they add to the George Floyd Policing Act, is this idea of licensure when it comes to police to hold them accountable, right? If a doctor does something wrong, even if they don't break the law, they may take your medical license, and then you can't practice anymore. You can't just sneak off to another hospital. If a teacher gets in trouble for messing around with a student, you're never going to teach in that state again. You're going to have to go somewhere else and hide. The idea that we could start finding ways to take the licensure away from police officers. Only about 6 states where that's not the case. But if they can increase that penalty, if they could say, you know what, maybe you weren't convicted by a jury for this crime, but we think it's unbefitting of an officer. Snatching your license, you will never be able to be an on-the-street police officer again in this state. These are the kinds of practical, functional changes that the public is in favor of, that Republican governors like Mike DeWine have pushed for, but the Republicans in the Senate are standing against.
Jason, I haven't talked to you since you were the first person we turned to after the jury news came in about the guilty verdict on all 3 counts for Derek Chauvin. What is your view sort of at the end of this week?
I pretty much feel the same, and I think this has been hard, and I don't usually, I don't sort of do performative emotions, but the fact that there was another shooting, the fact that we've had other instances of violence, the fact that we have an individual right now who got shot 10 times after he called the police, it has just renewed my sense and my belief in the urgency of now, and that we can't lose this moment, and that we have to make sure that whatever happened it is with George Floyd, if there is not policy change that goes with it, then this was not as meaningful as it could be. I look at the George Floyd Policing Act extensively. I think it's good policy, but it's similar to background checks for guns. If we say, hey, you know, we got to get background checks for guns and guns and guns, a lot of these mass shooters in Atlanta, in Parkland, in Colorado, background checks wouldn't have stopped these guys from getting guns because they didn't have a previous record. I think there's a lot of things in the George Floyd Policing Act that are great as far as collecting data and qualified immunity, but it wouldn't have stopped a lot of these police. It wouldn't have stopped Derek Chauvin from doing what he's doing. We need to be more proactive about this issue instead of reactive after violence has already happened.
And Rev, if you can just weigh in, I know you've had an extraordinary week in Minneapolis for most of it, and we're glad to get to talk to you at the end of it. But if you could just weigh in on the policy fight and on the legislative front, where do you see this bill going next? What is its path?
I think that the challenge with this bill will be, as Tim Scott sits with Congresswoman Bass and with his fellow Senator Cory Booker, is where they're going to try to compromise to try and help Scott get some of his Republican colleagues to come along with it, and whether or not it ends up diluting it to where it really does not represent anything significant. Certainly we in the civil rights community do not want to see them compromised to the degree that it becomes ineffective. The fact, though, that in this moment, where we have George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, all of these cases that have happened all while in a pandemic. Let's remember, Nicole, none of the cases that we're talking about, including the ones Jason referred to, has happened over a year ago. We're talking about all of this while we're under lockdown, while people are watching this and getting stressed out. If there is no new policy, and legislative policy coming out of that, we are in effect saying to the people of this country, we do not care that all of this has happened. How did we end Jim Crow? The Civil Rights Act of '64, which was national federal policy. It didn't end hatred. It didn't end a lot of attitudes, but it was a policy that set a marker there. We need to set that marker with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and go on from there and do a lot more work. But if we don't set that marker, we're sending a message that many of us are not prepared to carry to our constituents.
The Rev and Jason are staying with us for more. There are some Republicans in the state of Texas who denounced messages of extremism and white supremacist rhetoric. And then there's Ted Cruz. We'll bring you that story next.